The new Congress with two members who have already established themselves as leaders in the 113th Congress, Senator-elect Tom Cotton and Congressman Mike Pompeo. The conversation will be moderated by Bill Kristol, who serves on the board of directors and is a founding member of the board of directors of the Foreign Policy Initiative, point worth highlighting as we celebrate our 5th anniversary this year. Bill, of course, is the founder and editor of the Weekly Standard. He served in the executive branch as Chief of Staff to Secretary of Education William Bennett, and also as Chief of Staff to Vice President Dan Quayle. Bill, thank you so much for joining us to moderate this conversation, which we all look forward to so much.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank the staff at FPI early on in this day for their hard work in putting together what I think has been a terrific, already a very good first session with Senator Corker, about to be Chairman Corker, I guess, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and a bunch of interesting panels after this as well. Let me very briefly introduce Senator-elect Cotton, Congressman Cotton, Senator, I don't know what the right protocol is for that, and Congressman Pompeo. I was joking that with them before that it's very good of Senator-elect Cotton to condescend to still appear on stage with a mere member of the House. You know, these guys go to the Senate and they forget, member of the House? What's that? I don't know.
I'm senior to Tom for 30 more days.
Yeah, exactly, right. He'll take your calls.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
Right, that's good.
The bigger stretch was appearing on stage with you.
Thank you, right. This is off to a promising start, yeah, right. Very briefly, Representative Pompeo is entering his 3rd term as a congressman from Wichita, Kansas, graduated from first in his class, actually, from West Point, served in the U.S. Army, of course, a successful businessman, very prominent spokesman on national security matters, and a key member of the House Permanent Intelligence Subcommittee. Senator-elect Cotton, elected in 2012 from the 4th District of Arkansas, and now, of course, elected to the United States Senate. Graduated from Harvard and Harvard Law School, but I won't hold that against, I can't really hold that against him since I also went there. They like to have one conservative there at each time, so I was there for my time. Tom was there in the late 90s as the conservative, and volunteered and served as an infantry officer in both Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11. It's a great pleasure to have them both here. They really have been leaders on national security matters, and now in the House, and now one of them will be a leader in the House and one in the Senate. Let's cover a bunch of issues. I thought we might begin with what's in the news, which is it appears that President Obama has settled on a new nominee to be his 4th Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter. Tom Cotton, you may well be on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Even if you're not, as a senator, you'll have a vote, obviously, on his confirmation, and I'm sure he'll come see you, and you'll have a chance to ask him questions. What do you think of him, and also what kinds of issues would you like to raise at the confirmation hearings for the new Defense Secretary nominee?
Well, I'd say, first off, that I want to thank all of you for coming and thank the Foreign Policy Initiative for having us, and also for the great work that you've been doing for the last 5 years, and hopefully many years to come. I don't know Mr. Carter personally. If he is in fact nominated, then obviously I'll have a chance to visit with him, and I'll assess his plans for the job and some of the issues that we'll want to discuss today. But I think it's important that we note that, I didn't support Chuck Hagel's nomination 2 years ago, but I'm not happy that he was fired. And I don't think that he's the author of any of the problems that America faces in the world. The president couldn't fire his own worldview, so he fired his Secretary of Defense instead. And that worldview is still going to adhere whenever Mr. Carter or anyone else becomes the Secretary of Defense. So we need to have a frank conversation during confirmation hearings, during one-on-one consultations about, for instance, our defense budget, which I think there's now widespread agreement across our party and even with some Democrats is too low and that needs to grow, and we need to think about how to prioritize that spending based on the threats we're going to be facing in the future. About the lack of a real military strategy to defeat the Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria. Anyone who deals with the flag officers or some senior civilians in the Pentagon or recently departed knows that the White House has been micromanaging that operation and not taking the professional military judgment of senior commanders and how any defense secretary would handle that. Then as well as what's going to happen with Iran. The negotiations with Iran have now descended into a ludicrous farce, and it's time that Congress step in and take some action, and that has to be backed with the credible use of force. and the new Secretary of Defense nominee's views on that as well. So those are just a few of the high priority issues that we'll obviously want to explore whenever Mr. Carter or anyone else is nominated to be Secretary of Defense.
And we'll explore them also on this panel. Mike, I think you maybe when Ash Carter was Deputy Secretary of Defense, he may have testified before you on HPSI.
He did. First of all, I'd like to say thanks for inviting me here this morning as well. Thanks for all the work you do helping members of Congress understand these very important issues to America, frankly, the most important issues that we deal with as elected officials. I met him. When he testified, he was very technically capable, was candid. Appreciated that a great deal. That is not always the case when administration officials come testify before our committee, and so I appreciated that very much. I think Tom got it right. His challenge will be the same one that the secretaries before him had, which is that all the policy making has been removed from the Pentagon and drawn inside the National Security Council or even into smaller circles. And so he'll fight that. He'll struggle. And this is a man who in 2006 wrote about taking out North Korean nuclear capability. That'll be an interesting discussion if Mr. Carter continues to hold those positions, the positions that say we can't allow rogue nations that intend to do America harm, to become nuclear capable or capable of delivering nuclear weapons into the West. So I'm not sure his views coincide perfectly with this administration, and I'm not sure they matter. Yeah.
I mean, let me ask you, you both served obviously recently in the U.S. Army and are in touch both professionally and I'm sure personally with many active duty and recently retired military and as well as civilians in the Defense Department. We've had 3 Secretaries of Defense. Each has, after resigning, has either written a book or made statements that were pretty critical of the White House. And there's always a little bit of that tension, but it seems to me, having been around Washington a while, that it's pretty unusual. We're now in an unusual situation. What's your sense of how bad is the situation either within the Pentagon or between the Pentagon and the White House? Is it something really we should be, is it just normal friction, or is it really something to be worried about?
My sense is it is as bad as it has been since I served, and that's been a long time. I'm now a bit of an older man. But I've not seen not only just the most senior folks, but even folks that are down in the mid-range enlisted ranks and officer ranks don't have deep conviction that their commander-in-chief understands the task that is being put before them. And this is a deep bond between America and its servicemen, and I think that bond has in many ways been broken with commitments, demands placed on our service members without the resources or commitment to back them up. And so I have not seen as much, anger might overstate it, frustration would understate it, but somewhere in there just a complete absence of confidence that the commander-in-chief will lead what remains the world's preeminent power in the way that these folks signed up to serve.
And just on the intelligence matter, since you're on that committee and you alluded to other people testifying, is there a similar problem of White House micromanagement and sort of politicization of decision-making and the intelligence? We see less of the intelligence area is a little more of a black box than the military, obviously, in the Pentagon. Is it analogous?
Same issues, precisely the same issues. Deep control. You see this too in missions being now taken into Title X that were conducted in a different way previously. So you see them being brought into different spaces where intelligence community has done really good work. And I've actually applauded the president. He continued to do very good intelligence work in the Fatah and in eastern Afghanistan for the first years of his administration. And we are now months away from leaving Afghanistan. And the intelligence gap that will arise as a result of that is enormous and dangerous to America. And it has been pulled inside the senior leadership inside the White House in very much the same way you see inside of our Defense Department as well.
I mean, I think the relationships between the president and his senior advisors in the White House and the Department of Defense are probably as strained as they've ever been. And it actually goes back, in my opinion, to the very early days of this administration. The president wrongly campaigned in 2008 against the Iraq War, saying that we were going to pull all our troops out regardless of conditions on the ground, which had largely changed, and the war had been won by the time he was sworn in, but saying the war in Afghanistan was the good war that he wanted to focus on, I think probably to minimize criticism that he was soft on our national security. And then he got into office and he realized that he had to act on that promise. And I think he felt in 2009 during the debate about the surge in Afghanistan largely boxed in by his senior commanders and the civilians at the Department of Defense. I don't think they were trying to box him in. I think they were simply giving him the honest recommendations in their professional military judgment of the resources necessary to achieve the goals that he had outlined. And I think relationships have been deeply strained since then. But as Mike said, you see it down to the lowest levels as well. A lot of the people with whom I served are still, captains or majors, or now if they're enlisted, they're up to, sergeant first class, master sergeant, and it impacts their day-to-day life. They can't get a slot in Ranger School because there's not enough funding for it. They don't get as much time on the range to, fire their M4s or fire their tanks if you're a tanker like Mike was, or there aren't enough promotion slots, so you're losing some really battle-hardened senior NCOs and field officers, which collectively I've seen reports, could cost us 5,000 years of combat experience in our force in the future. So they really do see the impact, and I think they feel somewhat underappreciated for all the sacrifices they've made and the gains they've won that are going to be given back in Afghanistan, just like we've seen they were given back in Iraq.
Let me give you just one more example. So the president went to my alma mater and spoke at West Point. Always a dicey proposition for any of us, frankly. But he went there and talked about, and he was speaking to a group of young men who had signed up to serve our country, and he was speaking at their graduation, and he told them that among the most serious issues that they would face in their careers in the United States military was climate change. I have to tell you, I vaguely remember being that young man sitting at Mikey Stadium about to graduate, and that would have struck me as tin-eared at best, and had I been smarter, probably I would have said strategically wrong as well. This is the kind of disconnect that you see over and over again coming out of this administration, and it begins to wear on an armed force.
Let's talk about funding, since you both mentioned that, as that's the most concrete thing I suppose you can do in the Congress. You can't change the president's worldview much, I don't suppose, and can't change the last 6 years, but what about going forward? I mean, Republicans obviously have been committed to generally constraining federal spending, understandably, in my opinion. They were also at times said, though, you two certainly have been leaders in saying that we can't, on the other hand, sacrifice our defense. What do you think happens over the next year, the next 2 years, in terms of the defense budget? And particularly, will that National Defense Panel that Eric Edelman, who's one of fellow directors of FPI, will be here, I think, a little bit later, and Michelle Flournoy and others served on, bipartisan panel, which said the current level is unacceptable, needs an immediate increase as well as a considerable step up in the baseline. Is that having an effect on members? Is there a sense of giving a higher priority to defense spending as opposed to being a general budget hawk? What do you think?
I believe it is. I mean, there was a story today in the Wall Street Journal about Rand Paul having spoken at the Wall Street Journal CEO Council yesterday, and it's exactly what he said, that we need to increase our defense spending. We need to stop sequestration for the military. Now, in part, that can be done by continuing to put reductions in the domestic side, because, again, this goes back to the beginning of the president's tenure. In 2009, passed a $800 billion stimulus bill that threw the doors open at the Treasury for every agency in the federal government except for the military. So there is a lot of savings to be wrung, I think, in the long term from our domestic spending that we can at least use to bridge sequestration for the next year. I mean, ultimately, though, in the long term, we have to have an economy that's healthier and growing, and more people are working and paying into the tax system if we're going to have if we're going to be able to support the kind of defense budgets that we had in the post-war period for decades, and especially under Ronald Reagan when Mike was serving.
Yeah, I'd say, full disclosure, I voted for the Budget Control Act. I happen to continue to believe that it was a tool that was necessary at the time to begin to get discretionary spending back in the right place. I campaigned on it. I still talk about that an awful lot. It's really one of the two reasons, one of which we're talking about today, the other one that I gave up when it was a really great job before I came here. But we've got to get defense right. The good news, I think, Bill, is Tom mentioned Senator Paul, but I will tell you in a much broader way inside the House caucus. I'll speak to the 80 or so Republicans who came in alongside me who were dead bang determined to get our budget back in the place where we can have a sustainable defense force for the next 20 years. I think there is a deeper recognition today that we can't take defense to the numbers that are contained in the Budget Control Act. And when you stare at the spending profiles for defense versus the others, you see that the one that's really never got the benefit of the 2009-2010 increase in spending was defense. And so we simply need to take it back and say, put it pari passu with the other programs, and you get the money that I think Defense Department would tell you that they need, and that I think Tom and I would both agree they certainly ought to have.
It's funny, I don't want to intrude. I'll tell one quick story. Before you were both, I guess, here, before you were members of Congress, I was invited with other conservative journalists to a dinner with President-elect Obama. So this was January of '09 at George Will's house. It got covered at the time. And everyone made a pitch. And I thought, I'm not going to persuade President Obama of anything serious. He knows what he thinks, and it's not really what I think about most things. But I thought on this precise issue, he was going to do a big stimulus. It was obvious. Republicans were quite likely at that point, it looked like, to vote for. They were on board, at least the notion of some sort of stimulus. And I said, why don't you do some defense spending? In fact, that is the classic Keynesian stimulus. I think the normal Keynesian account of how the Depression ended has a lot to do with the defense buildup in 1940 and 41. And I said, just so you know, there's plenty of the refit after Iraq was considerable. It was obvious things you could do. And he really was not interested. I mean, he just said, well, but Bob Gates is taking a thorough look at defense spending. And I tried to kind of say, well, but this isn't really dependent on a thorough look. There's just $20, $30 billion of stuff you could do just off the top. And incidentally, if you're spending $800 billion, I don't know, just in a kind of normal course of things, doesn't defense get some bit of that? It was I think, reported at the time that how remarkable it is to spend $800 billion and spend zero on defense. But I think that is a worldview issue, not a technical Keynesian economics issue.
And I was in Afghanistan at the time, and I can tell you that we certainly could have used that money being spent, not for a long-term weapon system, but simply for axles and tires and wheels and so forth to continue to keep vehicles on the ground that were saving the lives of troops. And it would have actually put more people back to work immediately. I mean, these are plants that are here in the United States, and they have 2 shifts, and you could have easily added a 3rd shift.
And the Defense Department's good at spending money in the military. So it would be very shovel ready, They'd find people to wield those shovels, right?
They would.
What about Afghanistan? You served there. Mike, you've followed it very closely on HPSI. I mean, what do you think should happen, will happen over the next 2 years?
Well, I think what's happened in Iraq over the last couple of years is a premonition of what will happen in Afghanistan if the president moves forward with his plans to completely withdraw there. I hope that he's learned the lessons of his mistakes in Iraq. The fact now that he just authorized another 1,500 troops to Iraq, I think that puts us over 3,000, to me suggests he is at least making a slow motion, tacit admission that he was wrong to withdraw all troops from Iraq in 2011. And if in fact he had left the number that General Austin at the time had recommended, maybe we would have fewer troops there today than he's recently returned, and obviously the conditions in Iraq would be much better. The Afghan government has made significant gains in both the civilian and the military side, and most of our troops who would remain in Afghanistan would not be in a trigger-pulling function. They'd be providing intelligence and logistics and aerial support, and I think it would be the height of folly for the president to repeat his mistake in Afghanistan that he made in Iraq.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I mean, it's been, the president's been very consistent in setting deadlines and demarcations about where we're going to go and what we're not going to do. And we would be infinitely better off not only if he would support it in a better way, but talk about it in meaningful ways, where talk about the mission, talk about what it is we're attempting to achieve. It's those kind of things, and frankly, I think Congress can have a role in this too. We could demand that he continue to support the efforts in Afghanistan. Right? We have the capacity to at least make statements and indicate our willingness that we will support the president when he makes good decisions. We won't simply be critical because that's what we do because we're the party, not his. We'll take good decisions he makes and reward him and support him where it's appropriate.
And I guess the Republican House, another thing that was sort of underreported, supported the president on Afghanistan, and was it 13 when he?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think with a higher proportion of Republicans supporting him than Democrats actually in the House. So for all the talk of bitter partisanship on some of these foreign policy issues, there's been a willingness to support him when you thought he was doing the right thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What about Iraq? I mean, so you served there also, and current situation, ISIS.
Well, the Islamic State is clearly dominating the news from Iraq, and I don't think you can divorce Iraq from Syria, though. I mean, the Islamic State does not recognize the border between the two countries, and therefore we can't either since our enemy doesn't. The president, for the longest time earlier this year, had a political strategy, which I think was designed to get him through the elections, not a military strategy. And he still hasn't adopted a sound military strategy either. He still continues to state these very lofty goals, or instate, as we would say in the military, without providing anywhere near the resources or the discretion to his commanders to execute them. I mean, you really are returning back to the days of LBJ in the White House picking out bombing targets in Vietnam. And the president, if he's committed to that, to those goals, needs to empower his commanders and the troops who are in the field and on the ground, and of course increase that number if we actually are going to destroy the Islamic State, which I think is a national imperative.
Tom, jump in. So I think that's all right. you can't talk about what's going on there without talking about Iran either. I mean, they are everywhere. The reports that I think were in the press yesterday, perhaps, that Iran is now taking flights and attacking ISIS. By the way, in some sense, I think Americans will be shocked by that. Conversely, Iran has enormous forces and enormous support in Iraq already today. The Shia militias are being deeply supported by Iran. What you see going on in Yemen with the Houthis, Hezbollah's activity, right? So this stretches from Hamas and the Gaza Strip to Damascus, straight through to Baghdad. The Iranians are committed to making sure that they come out of whatever the battle ends, however the political resolution ends in Syria and Iraq. They are committed to being the victors and the controlling force there. And so when the president talks about tactics and things we ought to do, and he says we're going to destroy ISIS, without doing so much as making Assad even stay inside his home for 1 minute, the rest of the world sees that. Our Gulf allies see that, and they realize we're not serious, and they begin to take actions that are deeply at odds with America's national interest. And so you have failures on the ground, tactical failures in Iraq and in Syria, but you have enormous strategic failure throughout the Middle East taking place as well. It's very, very dangerous.
Yeah, you co-authored an op-ed, we were joking about it before, that was not in sync with the majority of the conference, I suppose. And what was that, August of 2013, when, saying that the president had belatedly...
September 3rd, about 8 a.m.
Sorry, your office got a few calls and emails. Anyway, saying the president had belatedly decided, it seemed, to do the right thing in Syria and finally intervene after 100,000 deaths and so forth, and us not doing anything when chemical weapons were used. And you, in a bipartisan way, said you were willing to support him if he was serious about it. And yeah, he turned out not to be serious about it, so it sort of was moot. But I mean, it is amazing, don't you think, how much damage our inactivity, I don't know what the right word is, our failure to do anything about Syria over 3 years, and the way in which that's metastasized is really kind of remarkable. It is now a serious threat now. I mean,
it is, and it's just a radiating catastrophe throughout the region. But the president's failure to enforce his own red line, a red line that he drew, the international community, whatever that is, didn't draw it as he claimed afterwards, but he drew, and then he said he was going to enforce it, and then he blinked on it. The consequences that's had throughout the world, and not just with Syria, and not just in the Middle East, but everywhere. So much of America's foreign policy is bound up with what our adversaries and our allies think of the president's character, of his spine, of his courage. And Mike and I, here in Washington, and some trips we've done, have heard from allies all around the world who tell us how damaging that was in their own region, and what a bad signal it sent to malefactors all around the world, whether they're nation states or whether they're non-state actors.
is that right, Mike? Intelligence would confirm that? I mean,
It would, no, it's very consistent that, I talked about our own soldiers not being confident in our administration, doing the right thing and being committed. I can tell you that folks watching us, whether they are our enemies or our allies, understand that this administration is not serious. I mean, we forget, we haven't talked, I'm sure we'll eventually come across it, but right, the Russians shoot down a plane.
we'll talk about it. Yeah.
Right? I mean, the Russians shoot down a plane, and if anybody can tell me what the American response was to that, I'd like to talk to you afterwards, because I've not seen it. I mean, this is fundamentally unserious, right? We begin with pulling missiles out of Europe. I mean, just the sequencing and the cumulative impact of America withdrawing, whether by stated purpose or more observedly by actions, has led folks all around the world to think we're on our own, we're going to act in our self-interest, and if we are counting on America, there is no promise that they will be there when we really need them.
Dangerous situation.
It's a very dangerous situation.
You were at this recent conference, I think, in Halifax. A lot of, Ted Cruz spoke about this yesterday, meetings that you all had, bipartisan delegation with foreign leaders. And he said it was striking how much uncertainty there was about where the U.S. is and what we're doing. Is that?
Yes, I mean, heard from many people, in formal and informal settings in Halifax, a conference of probably 40, maybe 60 countries, and deep concern about America's engagement with their countries or their region of the world, and the chart that the Obama administration was going to take, the path that it was going to chart forward, and a deep cry for American engagement in the world. I mean, I went to one last year in Munich as well, a similar conference, and I have yet to hear from a single country that said they want America less engaged in the world. And that seems to be the president. Part of the president's problem is that he views a lot of the problems in the world as a result of American engagement and leadership, and thinks that if we just retreat to our domestic shores, then the world would be a better place. And I think most people who are adults about these things realize that's not the case.
There's one place we're deeply engaged is in negotiations with Iran. You all have, I think, voted for sanctions in the House, and I assume sanctions or strengthening the sanctions will come back up pretty early in the next Congress. What do you expect to happen? What should happen?
Not much to add. You want to talk about bipartisanship, right? I don't know what we'll get, Tom. 95 votes in the Senate, 400 plus in the House for real and serious sanctions, perhaps even second-order sanctions, right? I mean, simple things, right? Just say, no, we're not going to let you sell what is now $65 a barrel oil any place in the world. Imagine the change. Iran's economy shrunk by 5.3% in the year prior to the commencement of our negotiations. And depending on whose study you read, it grew by almost that much in the year following. That is a radical difference. It is giving Khomeini exactly what it is he entered these negotiations for. And so whatever the outcome, and I heard folks say, well, we didn't get an agreement. No, we actually got an agreement. We got an agreement to keep the JPOE. We got an agreement to keep the current agreement. There was an agreement reached that day. It was to continue to allow Iran's economy to thrive, to continue to allow them to spin centrifuges, and to do almost nothing to prevent them from having a nuclear enrichment capacity. So we have an agreement. We're operating under agreement with the Ayatollahs, and it is not one that is in America's best interest.
Yeah.
And you think Congress should step in
Absolutely.
not later?
And we will.
You think so?
Yeah, I do.
It's an utter farce. And I mean, it's not just the negotiations over Iran's nuclear program, and the president has been acting like a love-struck teenager with Iran and Ayatollah Khamenei for 5-6 years now. I mean, he's written 4 letters that have been unreturned and unrequited, and now
I know how that feels.
Too much information here.
And as Mike said, I mean, we essentially do have an agreement. I mean, Iran is getting everything they want by stringing along these negotiations. We've conceded the right to enrich uranium. We've conceded them the opportunity to continue advanced research on advanced centrifuges. We've conceded the right to keep Iraq as a heavy water plutonium plant. We've conceded that we're not going to explore all the military dimensions. We've conceded they won't have to go through complete disclosure and inspections. We've conceded that we're not even going to put ballistic missiles on the table. And we've given them $5 billion over the next 7 months. I mean, why would Khamenei stop negotiations? Why would he reach an agreement in 7 months? He already has gotten virtually all that he wants. So we are being injured by the extension of these negotiations, and several members of the administration said 4 months ago or 12 months ago that this was just a short-term negotiations, they'd walk away from a deal, and here we are and they refuse to walk away. So it's time for the responsible adults in Congress of both parties to step forward and say we're going to put an end to this farce, and I hope that we do it very soon after the new year.
That would be an interesting.
I'm sure that, I mean, Robert Menendez just said yesterday that the White House and senior administration officials need to stop downplaying the role of sanctions. And I'm sure senators like Chuck Schumer would appreciate the opportunity to vote on a sanctions bill, which Harry Reid deprived him of for the last 2 years.
Yeah, I'm sure he's really yearning for that opportunity. Well, but that's what being a senator is, right? A congressman, you're supposed to step up and do the right thing and cast a vote. It will be interesting if you have a real vote on a real sanctions bill. I guess they could be exempt, they could be waivers and exceptions and maybe something. But the administration seems pretty determined to just be opposed. They don't want anything, right? They believe the status quo is fine, the extension is fine.
They didn't want anything. I mean, they talk about the sanctions now and how effective they were in driving Iran to the negotiating table, but they didn't want them on the last round either. They acquiesced when they realized there were veto-proof bipartisan majorities.
Yes, I think it was yesterday or maybe the day before, Susan Rice said additional sanctions during the negotiations would be dangerous. I remember vividly when I was in the private sector, I wanted all the leverage on my side in any negotiation I could possibly get. I wanted them to think that I was the sanest person in the room and that I was their only hope of getting the resolution that they wanted, right? And you wanted them, the bad guy, the used car deal, you wanted them right behind the window. Well, they're demanding that we take away their tools. They're demanding we take away their leverage. It is the most thing one has seen, and it's difficult to come up with a good motive for them having demanded that we not enforce a set of sanctions.
I think one thing I take from this is that the conventional wisdom is president's the president, especially maybe in his second term, especially in his final 2 years. He focuses more on foreign policy because he doesn't need congressional support, and there's a limit to what Congress can do. But actually, just listening to the two of you, between defense spending, Afghanistan you mentioned, Iran sanctions. It actually sounds like there'll be a pretty hefty national security agenda early in the new Congress that would actually make a difference. No, I mean, your colleagues agree with that. I mean, they've been pretty domestic policy focused, which I don't blame them for in the last 4 or 6 years. But it could be a pretty interesting moment.
I think it's broader. We shouldn't leave it out either that on June 15th of next year, the Patriot Act expires.
Say a word about that.
well,
somewhat controversial, I think.
So controversial in one sense. There's very widespread agreement that most of the Patriot Act makes sense. There are provisions that are indeed controversial that folks have concerns about civil liberties. Look, I'm a very conservative man. I deeply distrust the federal government in each activity it undertakes. So I am sympathetic to those concerns as well. But we've got to do this right. We cannot give away these tools that have been so important in our counterterrorism fight for now 13 years. And we've had a couple of these skirmishes on the House floor. Senate's had one as well. But we've always had the wind at our back in the sense that nothing has passed. None of the modifications that we made in the House, the ones that I thought were okay and not too dangerous, none of them have become law. But in the middle of next year, we must act. We actually have to pass something. And so I think we'll begin those discussions. Lots of committees, including my own, will be part of that. But very important that we get that right and we calibrate that correctly. This counterterrorism fight is going to be with us for quite some time.
And as a member of that committee, I mean, without saying anything you shouldn't, these are important tools. I mean, some people blithely say, oh, it's all, the intelligence community has a self-interest in promoting it, but really this stuff doesn't matter. It hasn't produced much.
There are lives that have been saved in Kansas as a result of these programs. It's hard to make counterfactual arguments, and I can't provide all the details, but I can tell you very, very clearly these programs are important and useful and are being conducted in a way that is highly professional with every effort to secure the civil liberties of every American while still accomplishing this important mission that has absolutely saved lives all across our country.
And you had a primary challenge, I mean, actually from a former member who ran
Who had a very different view.
Yeah, he ran partly on this
Yeah.
issue, and it was interesting. Everyone says, oh, the Republican base is so, hostile to the government, they're even hostile to these kinds of programs, but you won that pretty handily, as I recall.
The American people are prepared to do what it takes to make sure and keep America safe, and they want us to be very cognizant of the fact that they like their privacy. And if we do those well, and we articulate and we talk about what we're doing, and we don't allow members of our own conference to talk in silly ways to say that the government's listening to every one of your phone calls and reading every one of your emails. I've heard my colleagues say that. If we can keep them, and they, by the way, they do that knowing that it is not accurate. If we can keep them from doing that, if we communicate adequately and professionally and treat our constituents as adults on this set of issues, I think we can be successful with this.
You've talked to an awful lot of Arkansans over the last
Yeah,
year.
and I would say, obviously the campaign that just ended had a lot of major issues from Obamacare to immigration to our national debt. But throughout the campaign, in particular, though, in the last, say, 4 months of the campaign, after the Islamic State had really risen to prominence after Mosul fell, and then in August after they cut Jim Foley's head off, the most common question I would get on the campaign trail would be about national security. It would be about the Islamic State or about Iran or about Ukraine, and the general sense of American retreat from the world. And I can tell you that Arkansans don't want to retreat from the world. They don't want America to be humiliated. They don't want their fellow citizens' heads getting cut off. And I think you saw it a couple of weeks ago, right before the announcement of the extension of the Iranian negotiations. All 11 of the new Republican senators-elect, soon to be 12 when Bill Cassidy wins on Saturday, called for Congress to act if the president had such an extension. And then Gary Peters, the only Democrat Senate-elect, did the same thing just a few days ago. So it is something that came up in our campaigns and something on which I think you will see congressional action very early, in particular in the Senate, where there's been no action on these or really any other issues for the last 2 years.
What about the public? We'll take questions maybe in a minute, but I'm just curious still on this NSA intelligence issue. I'd say some of your colleagues, sort of their private excuse for voting for what maybe they acknowledge were excessive constraints or not well thought through revisions in the various intelligence programs was, well, the public's really up in arms about this and I need to give them something. But you both had tough campaigns this year, and in your campaign it really was a central issue in the primary, and it obviously came up in Arkansas as well. What is your sense of that? I mean,
yeah, it was a central issue. We debated it. had the problem that he'd voted for it 4 times himself when he'd been here before, so that was interesting. But suffice it to say, I'll have folks come up and express their concerns about provisions in the NDAA, about American action here, domestic surveillance issues. Look, we've got to do this well. Our national security apparatus has to do this well. It has to do it professionally. Congress needs to have oversight. That's an important part of these NSA programs. And if we do those well and we articulate that which is unclassified in a meaningful way, the American people will support this. I'm very confident. I've seen it in Kansas 4th Congressional District, and as I've traveled a little bit around the country talking to folks about it as well, they just want to understand that this isn't some rogue set of actors. They're especially concerned with this particular president, at least in Kansas, some rogue actor behaving without any oversight, without any boundaries to their activities.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. That I mean, Arkansans, like most Americans, worry about their privacy, especially in the digital age. They're more worried about getting nuked by Iran or having Islamic terrorists cut off the heads of their fellow citizens.
And more broadly, I said just finally on this, one other excuse, you talk privately, maybe to more moderate Democrats or some Republicans, and on foreign policy issues, national security issues, whether it's defense budget or intervention in Syria and Iraq or tough line with Iran or arming the Ukrainians, and the American public is war weary. I know that would be the right thing to do, but the public just won't tolerate that as much. Again, you've both been out much more than most of us in this room, out and about among the American public for the last several months. What's the truth of that?
So that I grow weary of claims of war weariness on the American people. And it's no surprise that the American people may be perceived as war weary since the commander-in-chief is the weariest one of them all. But over the last year in Arkansas, certainly, I have seen Arkansans who feel embarrassed by what's happened to America in the world and feel threatened by what is happening to America in the world. And while they want their privacy protected, they don't want to waste money on the military, they don't want to go abroad looking for monsters to slay, as John Quincy Adams said. They want to protect America's interests, and they want America to be strong and be a leader in the world. And we need elected leaders who will explain those things. As Mike pointed out on a lot of the terrorist surveillance programs, there's a lot of misunderstanding, not just among the American people, but even among members of Congress. That if they're not something about which they're passionate and deeply informed, they haven't gone into the secure communications facility to get the briefings, they may think actually that the NSA is taping your cell phone calls, which is not the case at all. So it takes elected leaders, and I think we have a lot of new ones on the way in the Senate and in the House for that matter as well, to help make the case for a strong and confident America in the world and the tools that our warfighters and intelligence professionals need to accomplish that.
Yeah, Tom and I have actually talked about this idea of war weariness, but that you will hear from time to time in different places. I don't have a lot to add. It's all about leadership, right? It's a deeply American tradition, right? From the very founding days from Washington and his talk about staying out of things that aren't America's problem. But when American leaders talk about what it means to America, when they talk about our own American interest and what it means to us, to keep us secure and to behave in a way that Americans can be proud of, I've found that any weariness vanishes and a desire to do the right thing emerges very, very quickly. But it does take a leader. It's difficult to do when there's 535 of you. It takes someone in the White House to really make the case for these important national security actions, and this president is loath to do so.
We have about 10 minutes here, I think, so we'll take questions. I don't know if do we need a mic or can I just call on people? I'll just call on people. Right here in the back, yeah, I can see.
How about repealing Executive Order 12333 so that we can decapitate genocidal world leaders?
Executive
How about
Order
it?
12333 is the anti-assassination.
A $20 million bounty on Bashar al-Assad. Let him retire to Tehran, and then we remove the bounty.
So
I don't know if that was exactly a question, but
Yeah.
you can comment on it.
no, that was more. Yeah, exactly. That was more, a pastor to his flock. Exactly.
He's here so you guys can appear moderate.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, thank you for that. I would say this. I remember, right? So President Bush talked about in the aftermath of 9/11. He said, not only we're going to go after the terrorists, we're going to go after those who took those actions and who harbor them. I'll have the quote a little mangled, I suspect. He probably mangled it too. But I agree with the predicate of your statement. It is the case that if America was clearer about regimes that were behaving in ways that we thought inappropriate, and that the penalty was not going to fall far from the top of the leadership of those regimes, a very different way than we handle our foreign policy today. If America made clear that that was our stated policy, we would be much more successful in getting the outcomes that are consistent with our American policy.
Yeah, I mean, I once heard the difference between a democratic military and a autocratic military is where the leaders stand. In a democratic military, the platoon leader and platoon sergeant are in front of their troops with their rifles aimed at the bad guys. In an autocratic one, they're behind the troops with their rifles aimed at their troops. And in 1991 and in 2003 alike, there were a bunch of poor Iraqi kids who were conscripted into the Iraqi army who had no loyalty to Saddam Hussein, but they knew that they and their families would be killed if they ever dissented. And is it really moral for us to be focused on killing those privates as opposed to taking on the leaders of wicked regimes like Iraq under Saddam Hussein? Those, in my opinion, are legitimate military targets, and oftentimes they can end a war with much less human suffering, not only on our side, but also on our enemy side and through civilian casualties.
Sir.
Carl Golovin, JFKVigil.com. As long as we're putting assassination on the table, maybe we should come clean with 50 records still sealed concerning Kennedy's assassination. Since E. Howard Hunt, for example, CIA operative, confessed before he died that he was involved and implicated other CIA personnel. So maybe if we want to do unto others the way we want them to do unto us, assassination should be just off the table. Didn't the U.S. really go rogue in '71 when we abandoned our obligations under the Bretton Woods Agreement? And might we not restore a more peaceful world if we recognized our obligation to have a stable monetary unit, both domestically under the Constitution and globally? And last question, World Trade Center 7. I helped clean up the rubble of World Trade Center 7. 47-story building collapsed in 7 seconds at 5:20 in the afternoon in New York City. Mainstream media won't talk about it because it points towards the possibility of false flag terrorism. H.R. 428, will you support it?
Tom, that's all yours.
I think,
Members of the House defer to members of the Senate on these.
well, Mike was the one alive during 2 of those 3 events. So I might defer to him. I'm sorry, sir, I have to say that I'm not informed about most of the matters you discussed, so I'll have to defer.
Yeah, that's not appropriate. Okay. Yes, back there.
I wonder if you, two distinguished gentlemen, would describe for me how you see the role of National Security Advisor should be performed, and if you think an NSC of about 400 people is useful. Thank you.
Now that is a start. I mean, I was in a long time ago, before Tom was born, but Mike and I were around.
I was around.
Mike was a kid, and I was in the White House as Dan Quayle's chief of staff. I think the NSC was about, I don't know, 75, 80 people. I remember we were scrambling to get one more person detailed, to help out. And I think it is now close to 400
it's between
people.
400, 450 folks on any given day.
How is it affecting things in reality? We talked a little about White House micromanagement.
So you have a number of things that follow from bringing, from running your national security and your foreign policy more broadly from inside the White House, right? Enormous accountability that is lacked, right? The senator here will get to confirm some folks, but very few of the folks now making policy decisions will have been confirmed officials. You also have processes. I will tell you that we have been pursuing documents from the White House and another committee that I sit on the Benghazi Committee. And each time one moves from the Department of Defense or from the CIA inside the White House, right inside the National Security Council, the claims for accountability are greatly diminished. And so you have 3 things happen. You have less accountability, you have a whole lot less transparency, and I think you also run the enormous risk of drinking your own bathwater. That is, you just have a bunch of folks around you that are your guys or your gals, and you are not getting the breadth of opinion that comes from running national security policy in a much more diffuse way.
Yeah, I would say, with one major caveat, the National Security Council has become too big and unwieldy and too much of a policy-making organization of its own. I was recently reading a book that had an account of the early days of the Ford administration and the steps he took to ensure continuity. And I guess under Nixon, Kissinger had been both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, and Ford was insistent on maintaining continuity when it came to national security policy, because it was a pretty treacherous time in the world then as well. But in not too long a time, Kissinger shed the role of National Security Advisor, remained as Secretary of State, and then it was Brent Scowcroft that came on as the National Security Advisor. But the point being is that the National Security Advisor, like the Chief of Staff, which was ultimately Dick Cheney, was viewed as a role to collect the views of cabinet heads and agency heads, and to be something of an honest broker to ensure that the president got the right kind of advice. And they're not, I don't think, playing that role now. Now, the major caveat, I would say, is in the end, any organization, whether it's the National Security Council or the Department of Defense or Department of State, reflects the leader at the head, and the problem goes back to our president, his worldview, more so than any kind of processes that he's put in place.
I saw recently that Bob Gates, I guess, told this story, I don't know, in a speech maybe, to a reporter. I read it just the last couple of days, about going to Afghanistan in the first months.
It's in his book, too.
You tell, is it in the book? I didn't, okay.
Maybe not. Yeah, he tells a story about there's a direct line. Is the story you're about to tell? Direct
From the
line
special ops, I think.
to the White House, and he ordered them to tear it down immediately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there really is a reason, I think this is important for Congress. I mean, there's an accountability issue when you have confirmed officials at an actual department with a line of chain of command at that department. You have a kind of accountability that you can't have when a bunch of White House aides who don't testify, aren't confirmed. The president can invoke forms of executive privilege for White House communications. It really does shut off. I think that's one reason it's grown so much. It shuts off real accountability to you guys.
Well, I mean, it just goes to show like how little the president and his senior advisors understand basic principles like the chain of command. I mean, there's a reason that Congress passed the Goldwater-Nichols Act 28 years ago and established the combatant command structures to report to the Secretary of Defense and report to the president. If the president wants to give orders to, the special operations sergeant or major out on the battlefield, then that's his prerogative as commander-in-chief. But that needs to go through the established chain of command, not go to, a junior officer in the National Security Council who was a driver of a van in Iowa 7 years ago.
Just offended someone very badly, I think we have time for one or two more. Yes, over here, I can't say, yeah.
There's such a compelling argument against fighting ISIS without also forming strong strategy to thwart and contain terror-sponsoring WMD proliferating states, Syria and Iran, and putting an end to the brutal Assad regime. And the argument is so compelling on both a moral and a strategic level that I wonder if now that the public is engaged in looking at the fight against ISIS and sensing all these bigger forces at play, if there's any thought to putting together a document that would outline grand strategy in the Middle East, not just for government, but for the public, just to get the discussion onto a much more intelligent level than it seems to be right now.
That's why we have important organizations like FPI.
No, I mean, it's hard for Congress, I guess, right? It really is a problem that you all will face over the next 2 years. If you want to be responsible, you want to seriously affect policy, and you can in the ways we've discussed, but there's only one president, and, a congressional committee can produce a document, you can produce ad hoc things, we can produce documents. It's not quite the same.
But I do think the function may be performed in the coming, say 18 months in the Republican presidential primary as well. One thing struck reading about the transition to the Ford White House and then the '76 election was the challenge from Ronald Reagan against Jerry Ford. People talk about the Republican Party being divided today, and I would dispute that compared to the Democrats, but think about that, a conservative challenge from the right to a sitting United States president. Now that's divisions, but a lot of the divisions were about national security and foreign policy, and I think we're going to have a real serious debate within the Republican Party, and the ultimate Republican presidential nominee may in fact produce exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about.
Either of you want to announce support for either your own candidacy or
Mike Pompeo.
support for someone else? Pompeo boomlet launched at Foreign Policy Initiative Conference. Okay, well,
To quote Michelle Flournoy, not me.
I want to thank, we're right at time, so closing words, anything we haven't covered that you'd want to say to people to think about? I mean, is there some part of the world, some issue that that's on your mind?
No, thanks for having us here. Thanks for your serious work, helping us all do our jobs better. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you both for being such serious and responsible members of Congress.